instead of our lungs or our pancreas. We aren't afraid to tell someone when we have asthma or pancreatitis, but we are much less likely to talk about our anxiety or our depression or the fact that we're bipolar or our obsessive-compulsive disorder or our schizophrenia. Guys, I think that's got to stop. Now, I've been a pastor for about 10 years, and in that time, in just my church, I have spoken with children, I've spoken with junior high students and senior high students, I've spoken with young adults, I've spoken with old adults, and I've spoken with really old adults. And all of those age groups have dealt with some form of mental illness or another. You see, we can deal with mental illness no matter who we are, no matter how young or old you might be, if you're rich or you're poor. And so we've got to talk about it. Mental illness is much more common than we think. The second thing I wish that I knew about mental illness as a high school student is that mental illness is a liar. Now, often when we're dealing with mental illness, the messages that our brain tends to send us are not really true. They can become distorted. They can often play on our fears and our insecurities. I know that this was the case with Missy's dealing with depression. And I've spoken with and I've listened to many other people who've dealt with anxiety or OCD or schizophrenia, and they have similar stories. Overwhelming thoughts and feelings. Feelings of fear. Feelings of inadequacy. Feelings that they will never be good enough to beat their illness. Feelings of despair that just come from nowhere. Feelings of crushing fear that keep them in bed for days. Thoughts that tell them that they are worthless or unlovable or hopeless. But you see, mental illness is a liar. If you are struggling with mental illness, it's not your fault. There's no rhyme and no reason to mental illness. You don't have to be in a bad place. You don't have to be a bad person to deal with it. In fact, often people dealing with mental illness and mental health issues are in a really good place. You could be the valedictorian and the star of your high school basketball team and deal with anxiety. You can be the head cheerleader and have depression. You can be the lead in the play or have a new job or a new car or a new child and deal with mental illness. Things can be going awesome for you, and that just doesn't stop something like anxiety or OCD or bipolar disorder from occurring. You know, it can be really difficult to understand how things can be going so well for you and all the while you're doing so poorly. So you wonder, like I know my wife often did, what is wrong with me that I can't get better? But remember, mental illness lies. We would never blame ourselves for having asthma, but way too often we blame ourselves for mental illness. And that is simply unfair, and it's untrue. Mental illness is a liar, and mental illness is much more common than we think. The third thing that I wish I knew about mental illness in high school is that there is help, and there's actually a lot of it. When we are dealing with mental illness, it can feel like we're all alone, but that simply isn't the case. As we've been on this journey with Missy's depression, we've discovered a multitude of different resources that have been there. You just have to know where to look. A couple of years ago, I went to this 3-day conference on issues of mental health, and one of the main things that I took away was the encouragement to build a web of support. A web of support is often made up of a whole group of people and of professionals that can help you out. You can start with your family, who are often the first people we can and we should tell about our struggles. The web can include your friends. It can include your church community, your teachers, your guidance counselors, your therapist or a counselor, your doctors, and so on. Locally, we have a lot of organizations like the Penn Foundation, who provide counseling services and family support services and mental health education and more. In fact, your church might have funds set aside specifically to help provide things like counseling and support for mental health issues. I know ours does. And I know that Missy and I and our family would not be at the place that we are today if it were not for a whole web of support that was around us. And that support starts when we choose to talk about it, when we choose to ask for help. And so my encouragement to us today is talk to someone about it. Talk to a parent, talk to a teacher, talk to a pastor or a youth sponsor, anybody. We need to talk about our mental health issues. Finally, last point. What I've learned on our journey with depression and mental illness, I've learned that there's hope. We worship Jesus. We worship a God of hope. One of my favorite stories of Jesus healing people is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 9. See, there's this woman who is dealing with a health issue, something that she's ashamed of, something that separates her from the rest of her community. But in her need, this woman reaches out to Jesus in the middle of this huge crowd, and Jesus notices her. And I love what Jesus says. Matthew 9 tells us Jesus turned and he saw this woman. And he says, "Take heart. Take heart, daughter. Your faith has healed you." Now, I love this story because it is a reminder to me that when we face something like mental illness, whether it's depression or anxiety, OCD, bipolar disorder, whatever, we can trust that Jesus sees us, that he wants to bring us freedom. So, what have I learned on this journey with mental illness? I've learned that mental illness is more common than we think, that mental illness is a liar, that there is help, and above all, that there is hope. And I pray that all of us here today can be carriers of that hope to those who need it, whether it is to ourselves, to a friend, or a family member, or anyone who might be struggling with mental illness today. Thank you, guys.